All right, welcome you. We got that transcript you sent over, and I've got to say it's a pretty fascinating one. We've been looking forward to digging into this with you. So today we're going to do a deep dive into a real-world scenario, kind of a case study, about how pharmaceutical scientists go about tackling these really complex impurities that sometimes just show up when you're developing and making new medicines.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really cool about what you've sent over is, along with the case study itself, you've got all these snippets from just this amazing collection of books, right? And they cover like everything from the very, very beginning, the spark of an idea in drug discovery, all the way to like the really nitty gritty of making these drugs on a large scale and navigating all the rules. It really gives you a good look at just how much goes into making sure a drug that's safe and actually works gets to the people who need it.
It really is incredible how much goes on behind the scenes. So our mission today is to really take apart this case study,
Yeah.
right? Understand what's going on. And I think the real challenge here is not only finding these little unwanted impurities, but like figuring out what they are and how to get rid of them. It's like detective work at the molecular level.
It really is. And it's absolutely vital in that whole process of taking a drug from like an idea in a lab to actually being available at the pharmacy. Like, think
Yeah.
about it. Teams of scientists with totally different specialties all have to come together. They're using some seriously impressive technology. Then you've got the regulators, like, watching every step of the way. And they're always working under pressure, these tight timelines. And it's high stakes, right? I mean, you got to make the right decisions and fast.
It's a lot to juggle, so let's just jump right in, all right? What's the deal with these impurities? I mean, why are even tiny amounts of them such a huge concern in pharmaceuticals?
Right. So it might seem obvious, like, of course you want a pure medicine, right? But when you dig a little deeper, there's a lot more to it. If you think about it, like, even just the stuff that goes into the drug, those are called excipients. The rules are really, really clear. You've got regulations like 21 CFR 211.56, which is part of something called Good Manufacturing Practice or GMP. And basically they say, like, keeping things clean and preventing contamination of the final drug, that's non-negotiable. Impurities, by their very nature, threaten that whole idea.
Yeah, makes sense. It's not just about like a little dust here and there. So one of the big takeaways from the Handbook of Isolation and Characterization of Impurities in Pharmaceuticals is that when you really understand these related substances, you can make smarter decisions early on, like when you're actually synthesizing the drug and figuring out how to formulate it.
Right, exactly. And it's not just about cleaning up a mess after it's already there. It's like if you can anticipate those impurities, you can actually change the process to make fewer of them in the first place. It's way more efficient, and it saves a lot of money in the long run.
And that same book, the Handbook of Isolation and Characterization of Impurities, it talks about stability studies, right? And this is like, they're not just seeing if the medicine will last on a shelf for a few years. They're like intentionally stressing it out, pushing it to its limits,
Yeah.
exposing it to crazy temperatures, humidity, acidity, alkalinity, even blasting it with light.
Yeah, it sounds a bit rough, doesn't it? But the information you get from those studies is super valuable. Like, by really understanding how the drug breaks down under pressure, scientists can kind of predict what impurities might show up over time or under, like, less than ideal storage conditions.
And here's the thing, those messed up samples, they become super important. They're actually used to develop those super sensitive analytical methods
Yeah.
that can find even the tiniest trace of an impurity in the final product.
So we're basically like intentionally breaking things to make sure the final product doesn't break, right? So speaking of impurity detectors, that case study you sent really highlights the importance of some super high-tech tools. Oh yeah, we're way past simple tests these days, and a big player in all of this is mass spectrometry. So imagine, like, this super sensitive scale, right? It can weigh even the smallest pieces of molecules. It works by separating and detecting these things called ions based on their mass and charge.
Yeah, and our source on measuring elemental impurities in pharmaceuticals, it talks about all the different types of these scales, right? You've got things like quadrupole, magnetic sector, time of flight, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. It seems like knowing which one to use is a whole specialty in itself.
It really is. And there's this really cool thing called collision cells or reaction cells that they use in a lot of these modern mass spectrometers. It's like a little chamber where you introduce a gas and the ions we're looking for, they bump into these gas molecules. And that actually helps break apart any interfering ions. So it makes it much, much easier to spot the specific impurity ions.
Wow, it's like filtering out all the noise so you can hear the signal, right? But then there's another big tool that kept popping up in our research, NMR spectroscopy. And I've always thought of NMR as that thing that lets you see the detailed structure of a molecule. But it seems like it's important for impurities, too.
Totally. That NMR spectroscopy source really emphasizes how powerful it is for looking at complex mixtures and figuring out the exact structure of what's in them. And get this, they can actually use it online now. Like they can hook it up directly to other separation techniques like HPLC or supercritical fluid chromatography.
So it's like having your forensic scientist right there at the scene, right? As soon as they separate something out, boom, they've got the structure.
Exactly. And NMR has other perks too. Like a lot of times it can actually tell you how much of something is there without needing a separate reference standard, which saves a ton of time, right?
Yeah.
And it can even study samples under all sorts of conditions, different concentrations, pH levels, temperatures, even pressure. That can be super important for understanding how those impurities might behave during manufacturing or storage.
That's a lot of flexibility. And speaking of real-world applications, the Handbook of Isolation and Characterization of Impurities in Pharmaceuticals talks about developing these high-performance liquid chromatographic methods to study insulin and how it breaks down. So it's not just theory. They're using these techniques on essential medicines, like right now.
It really is incredible. One thing that really struck me was that this whole process, it's not a one-person show. Like tackling complex impurities, it requires a whole team, a bunch of different experts all working together.
Yeah, you've got the synthetic chemists, the people who are actually making the drug molecules.
Right.
And they're constantly trying to make their process better, right? So they make less of those unwanted byproducts that turn into impurities.
Absolutely. And the Handbook of Isolation and Characterization of Impurities really makes it clear. Knowing about those byproducts, it helps make manufacturing more efficient and cost-effective. And it can even help them design future drugs that are more stable and less likely to form impurities in the first place.
And then you have the formulation scientists.
Yeah.
They're the ones who take that pure drug substance and figure out how to actually turn it into something usable, like a pill or a cream or an injection. And they have to think about how it interacts with all the other ingredients, the excipients.
Right. And the handbook really stresses how important it is to find any interactions between that active ingredient, the API, and the excipients that might lead to, you guessed it, more impurities. And that's not just about keeping the drug stable on the shelf, it's also about safety and toxicology studies. So formulation is really linked to patient safety.
Of course. And then there are the analytical chemists, the impurity detectives we talked about earlier, and you can't forget the regulatory folks, ones who have to make sure everything follows the rules set by organizations like the FDA. It seems like everyone really needs to be in sync, sharing info and working together.
Absolutely. Each team brings something unique to the table, and communication is key. That's how you find the best solutions and ultimately make sure a safe, high-quality drug reaches the people who need it.
So it's not enough to just develop these analytical methods, right? You've got to test them, optimize them, make sure they can reliably detect and measure those tiny amounts of impurities.
You got it. Method optimization, that's a crucial step. These methods, they're the foundation of pharmaceutical quality, right? They've got to be super reliable. And remember those stress samples we talked about? Well, the handbook points out that they're not just useful for spotting impurities, they're also really important for developing and challenging the methods that will be used for regulatory approval.
So you stress the drug, find the impurities, and then make sure your method can catch those exact impurities in the final product.
Yeah.
And those super refined methods, that's what you send to the FDA, right?
Exactly. And this all ties back to something we've talked about before. Good analytical methods are all about making sure the drug is the right thing, at the right dose, and pure. It's not just about finding impurities, it's about being totally confident in your ability to prove the quality of the drug consistently.
Which brings us to the regulators.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the FDA has super strict standards when it comes to impurities in our medicines, and for good reason.
Absolutely. Patient safety comes first, and uncontrolled impurities are a risk no one wants to take. So the handbook highlights that when a company wants to release a batch of medicine, they have to provide solid evidence that it meets the impurity limits, right? And they have to use those validated methods to prove it.
And then you've got things like 21 CFR Part 211, which lays out the good manufacturing practices for finished pharmaceuticals. It's basically saying that manufacturers need to have processes in place to minimize impurities all along the way, from development to production. It's all part of making sure the medicines we take are safe.
Exactly. And, even though we don't have specific recall examples related to impurities in these sources, it's a well-known risk in the industry. The book, Process Chemistry in the Pharmaceutical Industry, talks about how quality issues, including impurities, can cause huge disruptions and cost a ton of money. So controlling impurities is more than just a rule, it's about doing things right.
Okay, so imagine you're a scientist, you're working on this case study, deadlines are looming, and then bam, you find a major impurity late in development. That's got to be stressful.
Oh, yeah, big time. Drug development, it rarely goes exactly as planned. So picture this, right? You're in the final stages, everything's almost ready, and then this previously unknown impurity pops up, and it's a big problem. You've got to scramble to develop and validate a new analytical method that can accurately detect and measure it. Then you've got to assess the risk, figure out how dangerous this thing might be for patients. And worst case scenario, you might even have to change how you manufacture the drug, or even tweak the drug molecule itself.
That's a lot to deal with, especially with the clock ticking. And our source on pharmaceutical process development, it mentions that sometimes you don't find certain problems until you're further along in the process when you're scaling things up, like figuring out how to make a lot of the drug quickly and efficiently. So if you have to change things because of a new impurity, it could really mess with your production timeline and your ability to get the medicine to people who need it.
And to add to the complexity, that regulatory strategy, which good drug regulatory practices talks about, might need to be completely revisited. Do you prioritize speed, even if it means your label isn't quite as detailed at first? Or do you delay everything to make sure this new impurity is totally understood and controlled? Those are some seriously tough choices, and they have to be made under a ton of pressure. It's a delicate balance.
This really highlights how complex the whole process of getting a new drug to patients is. So for you listening, what about you? Can you think of any situations, maybe not even in pharmaceuticals, where you've seen this kind of problem, like figuring out these unwanted substances, needing all sorts of experts to come together, using high-tech tools, and having regulators keeping a close eye on everything?
It's a common challenge in so many industries, right? Think about product development or manufacturing, any field really. Have you ever seen those moments when a quality issue just pops up and everyone's got to think fast? How do those teams adapt and solve the problem? Those high pressure situations, that's when you see true ingenuity and teamwork shine.
So to wrap up our deep dive, we've seen that finding, characterizing, and getting rid of those complex impurities in pharmaceuticals is not just a minor detail, it's fundamental to making sure those medicines are safe and they do what they're supposed to.
Absolutely. It requires top-notch analytical tools, seamless collaboration between all these different scientific experts, a commitment to constantly refining those analytical methods, and a deep understanding of all those regulations. And all of this often happens under crazy time pressure.
It's a fascinating world that most of us never really see, but it's happening all the time to make sure we have safe medications. So here's something for you to think about as you go about your day. If it takes this much effort to guarantee the purity of our medicines, what other everyday things rely on that same level of expertise and control? Like what's going on behind the scenes to make sure all the products we use are safe and high quality? It's incredible to think about all that unseen work that makes modern life possible. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.